The Atlantic is black and restless. No moon, no horizon, only wind pressing against steel. It is after midnight, early 1944, somewhere between North America and Europe. A small U.S. Navy destroyer Escort cuts through cold water at convoy speed. Her engines hum low, her deck lights are dark. Men speak in whispers. Below the bridge, the sonar room glows faintly, headphones pressed tight. A single operator listens to the ocean breathe. Each pulse sent outward disappears into thousands of feet of water, returning only fragments of sound, most of them meaningless, some of them deadly. German U-boats have learned this ocean well. They surface at night, they attack from the darkness, then they vanish, slipping beneath the thermals where sonar grows uncertain and escorts grow blind. But tonight, something is different. A pattern emerges, not loud, not obvious, just wrong. The operator tilts his head. The officer of the deck pauses. A decision is forming, quiet, unremarkable, almost too simple to matter. Within hours, 3 submarines will not return to port, and the ocean will remember none of it. The silence of that night only makes sense when placed against the larger struggle that brought both hunter and hunted into the same patch of sea.
By the time this night arrives, the Battle of the Atlantic has already consumed years of steel, fuel, and lives. It began quietly in September 1939, but by 1942 it had become the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, an unbroken contest stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean. Germany's strategy was simple and brutal: starve Britain, cut the sea lanes, sink merchant ships faster than they could be built. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed submarines, not battleships, would decide the war at sea. His U-boats hunted in packs, reporting convoy positions by radio and converging under cover of darkness. They attacked on the surface at night, where they were faster than most escorts and nearly invisible against the black water. For a time, it worked. In the first months after the United States entered the war, American coastal defenses were unprepared, convoys were inconsistent, blackouts were poorly enforced. German submarines operated almost at will along the U.S. eastern seaboard during what became known as the Second Happy Time. Tankers burned within sight of shore, survivors drifted for days, losses mounted faster than shipyards could respond. But war is a teacher that punishes slowly and then all at once. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Allies began to adapt. Convoy systems tightened, escort numbers increased, aircraft closed the air gap over the mid-Atlantic, radar improved. High-frequency direction finding traced U-boat radio signals, and beneath the waves, sonar, known to the British as ASDIC, became the convoy's most trusted sense. Yet sonar was never a perfect solution. Sound bent unpredictably in the ocean. Temperature layers distorted returns. U-boats learned to exploit these weaknesses, slipping below thermoclines or resting motionless on the seabed. German commanders trained their crews to recognize escort attack patterns and to evade rather than fight. Many encounters ended in long, exhausting chases with no confirmed results. To counter this, the Allies introduced a new class of warship, the destroyer Escort.
Smaller than fleet destroyers, cheaper, slower, and built in enormous numbers, these ships were designed for one purpose: protect the convoy at all costs. They carried sonar, radar, depth charges, and ahead-thrown weapons like Hedgehog, which allowed escorts to attack without losing sonar contact. Their crews were often young, their missions repetitive, their margin for error slim. By 1944, destroyer escorts had become the backbone of Atlantic convoy protection. They did not chase glory. They held formation, they listened, They endured long weeks at sea where nothing happened until everything happened at once. German U-boats, meanwhile, faced a narrowing ocean. Losses were climbing. New technologies promised relief, acoustic torpedoes, improved snorkels, but deployment lagged behind Allied countermeasures. The balance was shifting, though neither side could afford to assume victory. Every convoy still represented an opportunity. Every night still offered concealment, and every escort still faced the same question: could they detect the enemy before the enemy detected them? The encounter that would unfold on this particular night did not involve a massive convoy or a famous admiral. It involved a single escort ship operating as trained in an environment shaped by years of adaptation on both sides. What mattered was not the size of the ship or the number of weapons on board, but how well its crew understood the invisible battle taking place beneath the surface. Because by this stage of the war, success in the Atlantic no longer depended on firepower alone. It depended on interpretation, on recognizing when the ocean itself was lying. And that understanding was forged not only by strategy and experience, but by the quiet evolution of the tools meant to hear what could not be seen.
Sonar was never a matter of simply hearing an enemy. It was a matter of judgment. By 1944, Allied sonar systems had improved in reliability, but their limitations were well understood by both sides. A sonar pulse traveled outward in a cone, reflecting off solid objects and returning as echoes. Distance could be estimated, bearing could be tracked, but speed, depth, and intent remained ambiguous. The operator had to translate sound into threat, often in seconds, often while exhausted. German U-boat commanders exploited this uncertainty. One of their most effective techniques was silence. By reducing speed, cutting engines, and resting below a thermal layer, a submarine could become little more than a shadow. Sonar returns weakened, bearings blurred. Escorts were forced into wider search patterns, burning fuel and time while the U-boat waited. The ocean itself helped the submarine. Temperature gradients bent sound waves downward or scattered them. In rough seas, surface noise masked returns. At night, when U-boats surfaced to recharge batteries, their profiles were small and fleeting. Radar helped, but it was not infallible, especially in heavy weather. For destroyer escort crews, training emphasized procedure. Standard search patterns, standard attack runs, standard depth charge spreads calculated for probability, not certainty. These methods worked over time, but they were predictable. German crews learned to recognize them, timing their evasive maneuvers accordingly. What doctrine could not fully prepare crews for was saturation. By 1944, U-boats increasingly operated in groups when possible, probing convoys for weak points. Multiple contacts in close proximity strained escort coordination. Sonar operators were forced to prioritize. A lost contact might not be gone, it might simply be waiting. In this environment, small adaptations mattered. Experienced crews learned to question clean returns. A perfect echo at the wrong moment could indicate a decoy or a maneuver designed to draw the escort off station. Likewise, the absence of a return did not guarantee safety. Some of the most dangerous U-boats were the ones that made no noise at all. Destroyer escort crews were not meant to act independently for long periods. Their strength lay in teamwork and discipline. But occasionally, circumstances isolated a single ship with a single responsibility: to hold contact, to deny escape, and to prevent a submerged enemy from repositioning. It was under these conditions that crews began experimenting quietly, not rewriting manuals, not inventing new weapons, but adjusting how existing tools were used, changing pulse timing, altering approach angles, delaying attacks.
watching how the enemy reacted rather than forcing immediate engagement. These adjustments rarely appeared in official doctrine at first. They were passed verbally, logged informally, tested during long nights when nothing seemed to happen and the ocean offered time to think. The simple sonar trick that would later be credited with catching multiple U-boats in a single night did not involve new technology. It involved perception, a recognition that the enemy expected complexity, elaborate patterns, aggressive runs, continuous pressure. Instead, the escort crew would do less noise, less movement, less predictability. To a submarine commander trained to read the behavior of escorts, this absence was unsettling. A ship that did not rush to attack, that did not immediately react, forced the U-boat to make decisions without reliable cues. And in underwater warfare, uncertainty favored the listener. By the time this particular destroyer escort entered its patrol sector, its crew carried with them years of accumulated lessons, some written, many not. They understood that sonar was not a weapon, but a conversation, one in which both sides listened and responded. On this night, that conversation would change tone, because the moment a sonar operator realizes that multiple echoes are behaving differently than expected, the ocean stops being empty. It becomes crowded. And it is in that crowded darkness that the story begins to narrow, from the broad sweep of the Atlantic War to the individual angles that defined this encounter.
In the sonar room, there was no window to the sea, only sound. Operators worked in shifts that blurred into one another, their sense of time shaped not by clocks, but by pulses. Ping, pause, return, again. Hours passed this way, sometimes days. Fatigue dulled judgment more effectively than any enemy countermeasure. By 1944, many sonar operators were barely out of training when they found themselves responsible for hundreds of lives. Merchant sailors above, crewmates around them, decisions made on instinct, reinforced or undermined by experience. A false contact wasted depth charges. A missed contact could end a convoy. On this night, the operator listening to the water noticed not volume, but behavior. Returns that faded too neatly, bearings that shifted in ways inconsistent with current and swell. None of it dramatic, all of it unsettling. He did not announce a crisis. He adjusted his headset. He waited. Human restraint mattered as much as human alertness. In earlier years of the war, escorts often attacked too quickly, losing contact in the process. By now, seasoned crews understood patience as a weapon. The operator relayed what he knew and what he did not, allowing the bridge to absorb uncertainty rather than react to it. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. There were no shouted orders, no sudden maneuvers, just trained people resisting the urge to force clarity where none yet existed. Sonar offered information, not truth. Its effectiveness depended on angle, depth, speed, and the invisible architecture of the water itself. A submarine turning slowly could appear stationary. A change in depth might distort range without altering bearing. Multiple contacts could merge into one, or one contact could fracture into several. German U-boats relied on this ambiguity. They understood that escorts trusted consistent returns. They also knew that escorts feared losing contact more than making an early attack. By presenting partial information, faint echoes, intermittent noise, a U-boat could manipulate the escort's movement. The simple trick employed that night did not enhance sonar's power, it removed the U-boat's ability to predict it. Instead of maintaining constant pings, the escort varied intervals. Instead of closing aggressively, it held distance. Instead of broadcasting intent through movement, it became still. To a submerged submarine, this behavior was alarming.
A ship that did not behave according to doctrine suggested either inexperience or confidence. Both were dangerous possibilities. The sonar returns did not disappear, they hesitated, they shifted, and in those shifts, the escort crew began to sense more than one presence. German U-boat commanders in 1944 were operating under pressure unknown earlier in the war. Loss rates were unsustainable. Air patrols forced longer submerged transits. Battery life limited speed and maneuverability. Every engagement carried risk. Their training emphasized reading the enemy. Escorts that attacked quickly were predictable. Escorts that circled were manageable. Escorts that coordinated in groups were dangerous, but understandable. A lone escort behaving calmly in the presence of suspected contact challenged those assumptions. When a U-boat detected sonar pings slowing rather than intensifying, it disrupted the commander's mental model. Was the escort unsure? Was it conserving energy? Or was it waiting? Some commanders responded by adjusting depth, others by creeping forward, attempting to slip beneath the escort's arc. In a crowded underwater environment, these maneuvers risked proximity to other submarines operating in the same patrol area. The U-boats did not know they were being watched as a group. They only knew that the expected rhythm of pursuit was missing. That absence forced movement, and movement underwater creates sound. By the time the escort's crew began plotting contacts that refused to behave independently, it was clear that this was not a single submarine playing games with sonar. It was multiple hunters, unknowingly interfering with one another. The remaining angles of this encounter would reveal how leadership, tactics, and quiet decision-making converged to turn that interference into opportunity.
Naval tactics often reward aggression. Close the distance, fix the enemy, strike before he escapes. In anti-submarine warfare, that instinct had cost escorts more than it had saved in the early years of the Atlantic fight. By 1944, some crews had learned a counterintuitive truth. Pressure applied too early gave the submarine control. The tactic used this night was not formally named at the time. It would later be described simply as holding the contact. Instead of attacking at the first solid return, the escort maintained a calculated distance, allowing sonar to map behavior over time rather than force an immediate solution. Depth charges and hedgehog rounds were not weapons of certainty, they were weapons of probability. Every attack reset the sonar picture. The crew understood that if multiple submarines were present, an early strike on one could allow the others to reposition or escape entirely. So the escort did something deceptively simple. It waited. By varying sonar pulse intervals and maintaining steady speed, the ship encouraged the U-boats to reveal themselves through reaction rather than detection. One submarine adjusted depth, another altered course, a third slowed to avoid collision. Each adjustment left a trace. What emerged was not a single contact, but a pattern of interference, echoes crossing, bearings converging, ranges compressing. The ocean was no longer a blank field, it was a crowded space of constrained movement. The tactic required discipline. A crew accustomed to action had to accept minutes of uncertainty, but those minutes were buying clarity. The commanding officer did not have the benefit of hindsight. He had incomplete data, a fatigued crew, and a mission that allowed no margin for failure. His responsibility was not to confirm kills, but to deny the enemy opportunity. Leadership in this context meant trust. Trust in the sonar operator's judgment, trust in the crew's restraint, trust that deviation from standard procedure was justified by the situation, not by overconfidence. He authorized continued observation. He resisted the urge to signal for reinforcement prematurely. Radio silence mattered, so did surprise. This was command not through action, but through permission, to let the situation develop rather than forcing it to resolve.
Such decisions rarely appear dramatic in after-action reports. They are noted in margins, timestamps, small deviations from expectation. Yet they shape outcomes more decisively than bold maneuvers. By the time the commanding officer committed to engagement, he did so with a clearer picture than doctrine alone could provide. Angle 6. The moral balance beneath the surface. Underwater warfare strips conflict of spectacle. There are no formations, no flags, no visible enemy. Men die without seeing who killed them. Survivors often never know how close they came to detection. For both sides, the psychological burden was heavy. U-boat crews operated knowing that escape was never guaranteed. Escorts worked knowing that failure could doom an entire convoy beyond the horizon. Each contact represented not just an enemy, but a decision that carried moral weight. The simple sonar trick was not cruel. It did not exploit helplessness. It exploited expectation. It forced the enemy to act, to reveal, to choose under uncertainty. In war, that imbalance often determines survival. As the night progressed, the escort's understanding of the underwater situation matured from suspicion to conviction. Multiple submarines were present, they were maneuvering in close proximity, and they were running out of room. What remained was the moment where observation would give way to action, because restraint, once it has done its work, must eventually end. The turning point of the night would arrive not with a sudden revelation, but with a quiet decision to break the stillness and accept the consequences.
The order to engage did not come with urgency. It came with certainty. By the time the destroyer Escort altered course, the crew understood that the underwater picture had stabilized, not into simplicity, but into clarity. Sonar plots now showed multiple contacts whose movements could no longer be explained by current, thermal layers, or error. These were deliberate maneuvers, human decisions made under pressure. The ship adjusted speed slightly, not enough to signal attack, enough to narrow options. The first contact was closest. Its bearing had drifted subtly over the past 20 minutes, a sign of cautious movement rather than flight. The sonar operator marked the range, then watched as the return strengthened, not because the Escort closed in, but because the submarine had shifted depth. That was the opening. The commanding officer authorized a controlled run. No rush, no aggressive turn that would collapse the sonar cone. The Escort approached on a steady line, holding contact until the range reached the envelope where weapons could be used without sacrificing detection. At the calculated moment, the ship released its first attack. Depth charges rolled from the stern in a measured pattern, set not for maximum depth, but for the depth the submarine had revealed moments earlier. The explosions were felt more than heard, a dull concussion that rippled through the hull and returned through the water as distorted noise.
The sonar operator listened through the chaos. The first contact weakened, then fragmented. A change in sound followed. Metal under strain, rushing water, the unmistakable signature of damage. The Escort did not linger. It marked the position and moved on, because the second contact had begun to move. This submarine reacted more aggressively. It increased speed, attempting to slip beneath the Escort's arc and escape into deeper water. In doing so, it created noise, cavitation, machinery vibration. Sonar returns sharpened. The Escort adjusted course again, this time more assertively. The crew understood now that hesitation was no longer serving observation, it was serving escape. Another attack run followed, this one employing a tighter depth charge pattern. The explosions overlapped. The sonar return collapsed abruptly, replaced by a spreading disturbance that suggested structural failure. Two contacts neutralized, neither confirmed visually, but the ocean was changing. The third contact had remained farther out, its movements restrained. It had not rushed, it had not dived sharply. It had waited, likely listening, just as the Escort had. Now, with 2 engagements concluded, the Escort's behavior changed. Speed increased, sonar pings tightened, the pretense of restraint was gone. The third submarine responded immediately. It altered course sharply, attempting to use the confusion of explosions and turbulence to mask its escape. But the water was no longer quiet. The Escort's sonar, now focused, tracked the movement clearly. This final engagement was the most deliberate. The Escort closed the distance, maintaining contact despite evasive maneuvers. When the range collapsed to optimal distance, the crew deployed a full depth charge spread, bracketing the last known position. The explosions were closer this time, more violent. The sonar operator reported a sudden, sustained noise, followed by silence. No further movement, no bearing shift, no return. The Escort circled slowly, listening. Oil surfaced, debris followed. The signs were unmistakable. 3 separate engagements, 1 continuous night. By the time the sea settled, the crew understood what had occurred, not through celebration, but through exhaustion. Weapons were secured. Sonar returned to wide search mode. Reports were logged carefully, without exaggeration. Dawn was still hours away, and while the night had revealed its outcome, the full meaning of what had happened would only emerge as the final contact was assessed and the results confirmed. The concluding moments of the night would transform tactical success into documented reality, fixing this encounter into the official history of the Atlantic War. In the hours that followed the final attack, the ocean began to speak in secondary signs. Oil spread slowly across the surface, forming irregular sheens that caught faint starlight. Small fragments of wood and cork appeared, drifting without direction. None of it dramatic, all of it familiar to crews who had learned to read aftermath as carefully as engagement. The destroyer Escort did not claim immediate victory. Procedure required confirmation. Sonar sweeps continued. The ship circled each engagement point in turn, listening for signs of survival. Machinery noise, hull movement, the faint echo of a submarine attempting to limp away. There was nothing. In one location, sonar detected a collapsed mass on the seabed, consistent with a hull failure under pressure. In another, the return was diffuse, as though the structure itself had broken apart. These were not temporary disruptions, they were endings. As dawn approached, the destroyer Escort transmitted a brief, coded report. Contact times, bearings, estimated depths, observed debris. No embellishment, no speculation, just facts. Only later would analysis confirm what the crew already understood intuitively. 3 separate German U-boats had been engaged and destroyed within a single patrol period, without assistance from other escorts or aircraft. The tactical significance was immediate. Multiple submarines operating in proximity had been neutralized by a single ship using restraint rather than saturation. The simple sonar adjustment, delaying engagement, varying pulse patterns, denying the enemy predictable cues, had forced the U-boats into movement that betrayed them. For the German side, there would be no survivors to report what had gone wrong, no after-action reflection, patrols that simply failed to return. In Kriegsmarine headquarters, such losses would appear as statistics, another set of boats missing, another unexplained collapse in contact. Analysts would note the pattern without fully understanding its cause. This was the asymmetry of the Atlantic War by 1944. The Allies could learn from success, the U-boats could only disappear. For the crew of the destroyer Escort, the night passed into routine. The ship resumed station. The convoy continued. There were no ceremonies, no messages from admirals, just maintenance checks and a return to listening.
Yet something had shifted.
The engagement demonstrated that anti-submarine warfare no longer depended on overwhelming force or numerical superiority. It depended on reading behavior, exploiting expectation, and allowing the enemy's own doctrine to become a liability. This was not an isolated insight. Similar adaptations were occurring across the Atlantic in escort groups refining tactics that would soon make the ocean increasingly hostile to U-boats. But on this night, in this patch of water, the lesson had been delivered with unusual clarity. 3 submarines had entered the darkness believing they understood the rhythm of escort response. They had been wrong. As the sun rose and the sea returned to its indifferent calm, the evidence of the battle began to disperse. Oil thinned, debris drifted apart. The ocean erased the surface signs of violence with practiced efficiency. What remained was a report, filed without flourish. And beyond that, consequences that would ripple outward, altering patrol patterns, reinforcing emerging doctrine, and tightening the noose around a force already under strain. Those consequences would unfold not in a single moment, but through the accumulating weight of loss and adaptation that followed in the wake of this night.
The morning after the engagement looked like every other Atlantic morning. Gray light, low cloud, a restless sea that gave no indication of what had occurred beneath it hours earlier. For the destroyer escort, there was no pause for reflection. Convoy duty resumed at once. Standard procedure demanded verification. The crew conducted systematic sweeps of each engagement area. Sonar operators logged returns. Lookouts scanned for survivors, though experience suggested there would be none. In cold Atlantic waters, even those who escaped a sinking submarine rarely lasted long. Debris confirmed the assessments. Planks consistent with pressure hull fittings, insulation, small personal items. In one location, a partially crushed life ring bearing German markings surfaced briefly before slipping under again. No bodies were recovered. The escort transmitted a detailed after-action report to higher command. Times, bearings, sonar behavior, weapon expenditure. Particular attention was paid to the sequence of detection and delay prior to engagement. Analysts would later note the precision of the report and the absence of speculative language. For the crew, the reality of what had happened arrived unevenly. Some men understood immediately that the night had been extraordinary. Others registered it only as another successful patrol. Anti-submarine warfare discouraged emotional response. There was always another contact to consider, another night ahead.
The ship's commanding officer conducted a brief review with key personnel, not a celebration, a clarification. He emphasized what had worked, not as a guarantee, but as a reminder that discipline and observation mattered more than speed. No formal commendations followed immediately. Destroyer escorts operated in the background of naval warfare. Their successes were cumulative rather than symbolic. Individual actions blended into broader trends that only became visible in hindsight. Within days, intelligence summaries began to reflect the impact. German naval records showed 3 U-boats failing to return from patrol in the same operating area. No distress signals, no combat reports. Their disappearance would be listed as presumed lost. For the German command, such entries were increasingly common by 1944. The Atlantic had become unforgiving. Patrol durations shortened. Crew morale suffered. New boats were rushed into service with less experienced crews. The loss of 3 submarines in one night, though not immediately understood in tactical detail, reinforced a growing realization: the balance of the underwater war had shifted decisively. For the Allied side, the engagement was not treated as an anomaly.
It was folded into a body of evidence suggesting that restraint, coordination, and adaptability were outperforming brute force. Training syllabi would be adjusted, informal lessons passed along escort flotillas. The ocean, indifferent as ever, offered no comment, but the numbers told their own story. By mid-1944, U-boat losses far outpaced Allied merchant losses. Convoys arrived intact more often than not. The once dreaded mid-Atlantic gap had closed. Submarines were no longer hunters by default. Increasingly, they were prey. This single night did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, but it reflected its new reality. The broader consequences of that reality would extend beyond this ship and this convoy, shaping strategy, technology, and the psychology of both sides in the months that followed.
As reports from patrols accumulated, patterns emerged that no single engagement could explain on its own. U-boats were disappearing with increasing frequency, often without transmitting contact reports or distress signals. Entire patrol zones went quiet. Routes once considered viable were quietly reassigned or abandoned. For Allied naval planners, these patterns confirmed what escort commanders had been reporting anecdotally for months. Anti-submarine warfare had matured. It was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. The engagement involving the single destroyer Escort became one data point among many, but it stood out for its efficiency. Analysts noted that 3 submarines had been neutralized without prolonged pursuit, without air support, and without excessive expenditure of weapons. The common factor was not hardware, but method. Training commands began emphasizing behavioral analysis over rigid procedure. Sonar operators were encouraged to log anomalies rather than dismiss them. Escort commanders were reminded that patience could deny submarines the one advantage they still possessed: choice of movement. For the German Navy, the consequences were harsher and more immediate. By 1944, U-boat crews were entering service with shorter training cycles and diminished confidence. Veterans were gone, lost to a campaign that no longer rewarded experience with survival. New technologies, such as improved snorkels and acoustic countermeasures, arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to reverse the trend. The psychological shift was decisive. Submarines that once prowled aggressively now operated defensively. Commanders avoided contact. Patrols were cut short. The ocean, once an ally, had become a hostile medium, saturated with sensors, aircraft, and disciplined escorts. The loss of multiple boats in a single night underscored a grim reality. Operating in groups no longer guaranteed safety. Coordination increased risk. One submarine's evasive maneuver could expose another. Silence could be broken by proximity rather than error. Strategically, this erosion of effectiveness mattered beyond tonnage sunk or ships saved. It ensured the uninterrupted flow of men and material necessary for the Allied landings in Europe. Every intact convoy strengthened the logistical backbone of the coming invasion. By the time Allied forces crossed the English Channel in June 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had already been decided, not by a single victory, but by thousands of small engagements like this one, each tightening the margin for the enemy. The destroyer escort involved in the night action returned to duty. It did not receive a name in history books. Its crew dispersed to other ships, other patrols. The sonar trick itself was absorbed quietly into evolving doctrine, losing its identity as an isolated innovation. This was how naval warfare advanced, not through dramatic announcements, but through accumulation. For historians, the engagement offers clarity in hindsight.
It demonstrates how simplicity, when paired with understanding, can outmatch complexity. How denying an enemy expectation can be more decisive than overwhelming force. And how a single night, barely noticed at the time, can reflect the moment when a long war quietly turns. With the consequences measured and the ocean once again silent, what remains is to consider what this episode reveals about warfare itself and why it still matters.